Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mental Health on the Mic. I'm Bennett,
And I'm Lorraine.
and I'm full of energy right now, Lorraine. It's
So
our
am
season
I.
3 finale. I'm excited.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy. We went through a whole other season together. It's
I
amazing.
know. It's really awesome. And if you're new to Mental Health on the Mic, we are a mental health podcast geared towards teens and young adults, but we certainly welcome everybody. And we have a lot of different conversations on this show, Lorraine. I mean, this season alone, I think we've really covered a lot of different grounds in terms of mental health. We want to be a platform for anybody and everybody, meaning, what we all are going through stuff, so why not have interesting conversations about different things pertaining to mental health, have a variety of guests like we're going to have on this episode. And I would say overall, our goal is just to kind of help destigmatize this thing called mental
Yes.
health. Would you say so?
Oh, 100%. I feel like there's so much negativity towards, having mental health issues or struggling with mental health. So I'm very excited to be part of this project to help destigmatize that.
Yeah, no, it's an honor to be able to bring you these episodes and to hopefully make an impact. And today we have a guest for our season finale who we're going to get to in just a minute, Dr. Steve Rappleyea. And he is quite the expert when it comes to mental health. I mean, he works with teens, young adults. He has so much experience in the field of education. So when it comes to educating you, the listener, we literally have an educator. So that's what more could you ask for on this finale episode?
Exactly.
We've had a good season, right? I mean, this has been a really
We
special
have, it's been a
experience.
revolutionary season, if I want to call, if we like coin it that. Like, if I'm not mistaken, I think we started off this season without even meeting in person before.
That's
We were
correct.
still,
Yeah.
Maryland, New York,
Yeah.
and we actually had our first in-person podcast this season.
We did. That was really fun. We reflected on that on last week's episode because that was now 2 episodes ago. Episodes are just flying by, you know? It's like, when did we do this? When did we do that? I don't know. It's all kind of a blur in the best way. I mean, I'm really proud of like the variety of guests we've had this season.
Yeah. We
Um,
had so many ranging from my friends, people you've known,
who I go to school
um,
with and
professionals, people from, television. Like we have a whole range. And I'm so
yeah.
proud of that because I know season two, we didn't really have guests, it was just us.
Yeah.
So this season was like a whole new thing. And I think it turned out amazing.
Yeah. And us alone is pretty fun, but us with guests is like a real fun
It's so
time.
fun. We have a new perspective and
Yeah.
it's new, it's different, and it welcomes new perspectives, new ideas. So,
Yeah. Well, without further ado, I think we want to bring in our guest now, and we're going to let him introduce himself because we want to make sure we give you a proper introduction. And there's a lot that this man has to say, which is awesome. We love the level of expertise that Dr. Rappleyea is going to bring us. So, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Steve Rappleyea to Mental Health on the Mic.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, you are an educator with a wide range of experience working with teens and young adults, and you're a huge advocate for spreading awareness about mental health. And I'm going to let you explain everything that you do just to make sure we give you the perfect introduction. So, without further ado, if you could just explain to us, where you've been in your career and where you are currently, that'd be great.
Sure, sure. Thank you so much. So, being at the far end of my career, I'll try to be brief and give you a sense of how I got to where I am today. Um, I began my academic training as a psychologist, completed a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in psychology, and then specialized in school psychology and went to work in the public school systems as a school psychologist. What a school psychologist does is not often well understood by those outside of schools. School psychologists serve really two functions. One, the lesser of the functions is mental health support for students. The larger function is assessment of students who have disabilities. One of the key functions that a school psychologist serves is the evaluation and identification of students who may have learning disabilities or other sorts of academic disabilities. School psychologists are kind of like academic detectives, and the work that they do is to help very accurately identify the needs of students and the best way to meet those needs. And I really have enjoyed my career starting as an academic detective, if you will, and ending up at this end of my career working as what I call a learning engineer an evangelist for multi-tiered systems of support. And I could talk a little bit more about that. After, the route from school psychologist to where I am now included more academic work, more training in academic leadership and becoming a school leader. I've worked as a assistant superintendent in several districts, but I've also had the opportunity to work as a regional consultant in something in New York State we call lovingly the network, but it is a network of supports funded by New York State Education Department to serve districts who require special education improvement. And that network is made up of, I believe, 12 regions across the state that provide expertise to school districts who require assistance. In doing this work and in leading in schools, one of the things that we have been tracking over the past really 6 or 7 years, I'd say, prior to the pandemic, were increasing numbers of students in pretty significant mental health distress. Now, one of the things that we've always done is we've always had systems available to support students in crisis. But what we were tracking across the country have been pretty unprecedented numbers of students experiencing depression and anxiety and the related destruction to their path, their life's path, that those feelings and experiences can bring. And because students in schools spend most of their waking hours in front of teachers and educators, having better responses in schools is absolutely paramount. So what I worked very hard on over the past 6 or 7 years was developing systems in schools that both respond well to student crisis and identify that crisis as early as possible. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about that later, if time allows. And at this end of my career, I'm a few years from possibly retiring, and what I've managed to end up in is a position where I act on behalf of the New York State Education Department in something called the MTSSI Center, the Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Integrated Center. And what we do statewide is set up model programs for identifying student need and creating systems of intervention that provide support for students. And I can't, I have to pinch myself. I feel so lucky to be able to do this work with across the state and to be able to talk to people like you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's an honor to have you on our show and to get that perspective because, right in line with what we're aiming to do, which is we want to reach teens, young adults. I mean, probably right in the demographic that's, the kids you're working with. And so I think overall, it's so important, but it's also interesting, I think, in the last couple of years, seeing the rise in this mental health crisis. I think, it wouldn't become such a prevalent topic if we weren't seeing such a rise in anxiety and depression and, the ultimate tragedy of suicides that, sometimes can occur. And for you being in the school environment and being with an age range of people who just really have been going through a lot these past couple of years, it's such a big question, and I don't even know if there's an answer to ask, like, is there a root or maybe it's there's probably several answers as to where this is coming from. Why now? Why are so many young people struggling to be okay?
Right. So in that, I'm hearing, this question about how did we end up here? What is causing this? And there's a few factors that we have been studying more closely recently. Some of those factors are factors related to trauma, which has certainly been a almost universal experience for our society through the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
We've had numerous people experience very high levels of traumatic events, everything from just, from being worried 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, really physically feeling that sense of fight or flight all day, every day because of this threat to our health, but also the very present factors of people losing loved ones, of people becoming ill and not knowing what that illness might mean for them. I have heard on numerous occasions about children telling their teachers or staff who work with them that they're afraid that they're going to bring home COVID to their parents and that it will kill their parents, right? So at no time in history, at least in recent history, have we had this societal experience where the stakes seem very, very high, and children, young children, have had this sense of concern that they would be the cause of their own parents' death. And that is tremendously impactful. And that's one element on top of elements that were already there. Remember, we've been tracking, this rise in depression, anxiety, increases in suicide and completed suicides for students before the pandemic. So what accounts for that? There's research in sort of broad mental health wellness that divide experiences and cultural elements into protective factors and risk factors, right? There are certain risk factors that are very clear indicators that someone, for instance, may be at higher risk for suicide. So knowing somebody who completed a suicide is a risk factor. On the other side, protective factors include things like having a close relationship with an adult, a mentor, if you will, some adult that a child could turn to and feel confident that they will be heard and that maybe some of their problems will be solved. And there's on each side of the equation, there are numbers of things. But if you look at where children are today, the number of protective factors that they have in their lives versus the number of risk factors that they have in their lives is become a little out of balance. We have higher numbers of children, for instance, with sleep disturbance, and we know how to interrupt sleep disturbance. We know how to treat it, if you will. We know the things that work, but unfortunately, we have these societal pressures and pulls that create difficulty with sleep. And we all know, just from our own experiences, what a day with very poor sleep the night before is like versus a day where you feel rested. Well, if you continue with that rest deficit, the levels of cortisol in your bloodstream increase. Cortisol is the stress hormone, right? And that increased cortisol then in turn creates the experience of stress, which then sort of feeds itself, and you ruminate about the stress, and your day becomes worse and worse and worse. So just simply not getting enough rest. So we know that students, children and adults spend far too much time in front of screens, right? And the pandemic certainly didn't help with that. We spend this amount of time in front of these screens, and oftentimes it's not just the time in front of the screen, but it's the continuous time in front of the screen and the inability to sort of exit the screen and do restful things. I know that I'm guilty of watching TikTok videos right before going to bed, just like an hour of videos. It goes by in a flash, and what happens is your central nervous system is on high alert, fully activated, and to go from that full activation to full sleep in a few minutes is almost impossible. And you can only do it if you have really good other sleep practices, and most people don't. So those are some of the reasons why we're where we are, right? Families are under more stress. Children have less contact with communities of support. Mindfulness practices have been used to replace day-to-day activities that had mindfulness value. Just simply being outside in nature and being bored, ironically, is tremendously reparative. And we have programmed that out of the lives of most children. right? So, and what we've done to replace it is now to create opportunities for students to learn things like meditation and other mindfulness practices. I feel like I'm going on a little bit, but those are some of the factors that I think about all the time, and I talk about with my colleagues regularly.
Yeah, well, we certainly appreciate such a thorough response. I mean, Lorraine, I was thinking about you as we were listening to that, because I mean, you've talked a lot on the show about your feelings towards COVID and how it impacted you. And
Oh yeah.
overall, I mean, we're both students. I'm in college. Lorraine's, finishing out high school. And I'm just curious, Lorraine, what thoughts you may have or questions, considering that, a lot of this stuff pertains to both of us that we were listening to just now.
Yeah, COVID hit at a really interesting time for me. I was a freshman in high school, and freshman year is that, first year of high school. It's you're getting into this new environment, this new realm. And March we got the call and school shut down, and they said it was just for a 2-week thing, and then it turned out to be the rest of the year we were online with schooling that wasn't the same as if we were in person, obviously. And so a lot of my high school experience, I'm a junior now, but from freshman to now, like, it's been completely different, completely not the normal thing that kids previously and have experienced. So for me personally, I experienced some emotions going into not being in the same environment, not having my extracurriculars, not having clubs, not having social interaction on a daily basis like I was used to. So for me, it did affect me, but I think I would say that I probably dealt with it better than other students might have. So I'm just wondering, in this time, 2022, have you seen any sort of improvement in mental health from, let's say, 2020 to now? Is there a significant improvement? Is it still struggling? Because I mean, for my school personally, in like Dutchess County, New York, we're not wearing really masks. Everything is pretty much to where it used to be. So sports are back, clubs are back, graduations are back, proms are back. So, and I'm sure mostly across New York State, that's about the same. So in other states around the country. So is there any improvement? Have you seen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to first, before I answer it, sort of highlight some of the things that you pointed out, which I think are fascinating to me because they match so well with what we were concerned with, I was concerned with at the beginning of the pandemic. When you mentioned things going back to normal, you kind of mentioned two classes of things. You mentioned things that were rituals, right? Prom, graduation, these events in our lives that mark a moment in time that we pass through, never to pass through again, right? Our prom is so important, not because it's a really great dance, although it might be, but it's so important to us because it's sort of a rite of passage, right? Mm-hmm. Graduation, right? That moment where you stand before your peers, your teachers, and your family, and you are awarded with a degree. And that degree represents, especially high school graduation, it represents the culmination of 13 years of school, right? Of kindergarten plus 12 grades. Mm-hmm. That is a monumental experience that people missed during the pandemic or had altered during the pandemic. And then, so that's one class of things. The other class of things are those group affiliations. We know, when in talking about protective factors, one of the things that is highly predictive of emotional and mental resilience is group belonging. So if you're on a sports team, if you're in a club, for those who go to college, it could be a sorority or fraternity, could be ROTC. Any of those sort of group structured belonging social constructs really create a strong supportive factor for folks. And when the pandemic locked us all away in our homes, those things really became distant, and it was just us in front of our computers. And creating them in front of those computers was really difficult. The good news is, over a couple of years, we solved some of that difficulty and created some opportunities for belonging within this digital experience. But you asked me if I thought things had gotten better. I would give a qualified kind of.
Okay.
People are able to be supported in social settings again. Staff and students are able to come together and engage in the happy accidents of interaction that occur that don't require planning. Right? Think of what it took for us to coordinate this, and I deeply apologize for my disorganization in getting to this Zoom. But if we were three people in a house, or three people in a store, and we wandered into each other, we could have a brief conversation about some of these topics. But if we're all locked away in our homes, the only way we interact is by agreeing to meet in this digital space. And because of that, there are less, what we call water cooler conversations, the conversations that occur by chance in a hallway, in front of a locker, et cetera, and so forth. Well, now those things are back, and people have the opportunity to interact socially in much more effective ways than we had. I would also add that we, in general, as educators, have gotten much more serious about how we address the mental health of both the children in our care and of ourselves. The pandemic was, kind of a watershed moment for us in terms of revealing our vulnerabilities. And as individuals, we learned we had to take much better care of ourselves. And as members of society, it was really clear we had to do a much better job taking care of each other. Because of that, I think we are getting a little bit better.
Mm.
I think it's good to hear. And, I mean, to bring it back to what you said about we were having problems before the pandemic, and the pandemic probably heightened everything. And it almost was a moment in time where I imagine for you and your staff, it was a chance to reevaluate, to realize that you had this time to figure out ways to build on what you have already set up and make improvements. Now, with the fact that, as Lorraine said, things kind of feel normal, but, regardless of having social interaction or, a sense of routine, everybody still goes through things regardless of whether or not there's a mask on or whether or not they are with people or by themselves. There's a lot of challenges that we all face on a daily basis. And the fact, Dr. Rappleyea, that you work in schools and you see students of different ages from all different backgrounds, we actually have talked a lot on this show, and a lot from my own personal experience, about learning challenges, learning disabilities. And I'm not sure how much you have, specifically worked with students on customizing something of a unique experience for them in their education to be able to get through school despite the obstacles and challenges. But at the end of the day, Lorraine and I, we've talked about it, and that can be a huge factor in the mental health of young people who are in their education, who are trying to learn and get to that next pivotal point in their life, or, getting to another rite of passage, their college graduation, for example, or even if they are still in high school. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the challenges that some students face that you have seen when it comes to dealing with learning challenges and how it may affect their mental health?
Sure. So let's use a sort of a big frame that we could all understand. And that frame is the experience of having an expectation, right? We have a mental model for a variety of things. You name it, we've got an idea about it. So, for instance, graduation. We talked about graduation before. We have a picture of what graduation looks like. And I could poll you, I'm willing to guarantee that if I were to ask you what you visualize when you see graduation, you see a cap and a gown, you see a stage, you see people walking, receiving a diploma. And, and being announced as you go across the stage. Well, that expectation may be altered. Even that simple expectation may be altered for somebody who has a disability. First of all, somebody who's in a wheelchair might not be walking across the stage. So how is that accommodated for? Somebody who has a pretty significant educational disability may in fact not receive a New York State Regents diploma. They may receive something else. And how their school handles that varies. So that expectation and it not being met creates a sort of a wellness challenge, a challenge to students' experience of themselves, how they think about themselves in the world, and in some cases can create an obstacle to experiencing well-being. So it's really important to think through every element, every structure, every event, every ritual, every routine that we do in schools as it impacts the students that we have care of. Students with disabilities are not necessarily any less resilient than any other person. In fact, many have to demonstrate greater resilience because their challenges are often more significant. But those risk factors that I spoke about before can exist in higher numbers for students who have a disability. Experiencing being moved from the regular classroom environment to a more specialized classroom environment is often experienced or can be experienced in a negative fashion. So how do we create structures, environments where that movement seems normal? Something called Universal Design for Learning, UDL, which conceptually is a way in which we can design learning spaces that fit all learners. So just like, I mentioned a student with a wheelchair before, we have designs for buildings that will ensure that both students in wheelchairs and students who are ambulatory can enter the building without obstacle. But we haven't fully executed them everywhere. We have these things called stairs often instead of ramps or elevators. If every building was built with only ramps and not elevators, or not stairs, the experience of being in a wheelchair would not be as significant. So that's a universal design that's sort of very physical. But creating lesson plans, for instance, that have visual elements, not just language-based elements for students who have difficulty reading, or for students who are English language learners, right? That's the idea of universal design for learning. That's a way in which we can create an experience in school that's much more welcoming and friendly, and in that way create opportunities for social emotional well-being for students rather than obstacles.
Lorraine, any thoughts you might have on anything that he just said? Or I know you have a lot of different perspectives as a student, but I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's great that the advances that people like you are taking for schools across the country, and especially in New York State, because it's true, like my buildings, they have stairs. I mean, I know the middle school, I don't think they have elevators, but in the high school we do, fortunately. But I don't know what episode I talked about this on the podcast, but I preached upon the fact that the school environment is so important to suit everyone and to suit everyone's personal needs and physical needs, because these students are there 5 days a week for 180 plus days of the year. Like, this is a bulk of their time that they're there for years of their childhood. And these environments have to be positive for them. They have to work for them. Because, a lot of kids, they wake up in the morning and their escape is school. Their escape is that environment. And so if they don't feel safe in that environment, what is safe for them?
Right.
So it's a big environment that I feel like a lot of people don't really think about, but people like you do, and you understand that. and you're making great strides to make it so that every individual student, no matter what background they have, what physical disabilities they have, what mental illness or anything they're struggling with, that environment has things put in place so that they feel like they're accounted for and that they're going to thrive there. So I really commend you for your work in New York State, and hopefully, states follow suit and we can make the whole country as a whole, and maybe beyond, if we're getting, global, the same thing. So.
Yeah, thank you. Lorraine, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Your experience in school, did you find school to be a place that was a refuge or a haven, if you will, a place that you felt cared for and supported?
In my experience?
Yeah.
I think for the most part, yes. I think if we're getting more personal, I think my mother's upper hand in some situations helped with that. But I do think elementary school is a bit rough for me. But then I did move schools in fourth grade. And I think the school where I am now is better for me in terms of people, in terms of teachers. I think the teachers that I had really supported me. I went, if you know, from this New York State testing system, I got a 1 in fourth grade for math, which is not good. And then, no, fifth grade, I got a 1. Sixth grade, I had this amazing math teacher. I got a 4. Wow. And that was drastic improvement for the state assessment. So I was lucky, and then I had a really good team of teachers for middle school, and now I'm taking APs. I'm in AP calculus. So if you're going from fifth grade having a 1 to now preparing for an AP calculus AP exam, I think that's pretty immaculate. So I think I'm very blessed with the schooling that I've had in New York. So.
It's as I listen to you share that story, the first thing that I'm just it sort of drags at my heart a little bit is that luckily the story has a wonderful arc to success, but this knowledge of yourself in fourth grade getting a 1 on the state assessment as being a part of your story is just right. It's so very heartbreaking, right? And you think about students who have that experience and don't have the success later to claim as you do. It seems to me like there's got to be some better way that we can do this work of assessment without having students sort of tag it, and understand it as so clearly about them. Because the story you're telling, and I'm not sure you mean to tell it this way or not, but the story that you tell that I hear is a story of how the schools served you as a student, right? So the 1 that you got in fourth grade wasn't about you. To my thinking, your teacher got a 1, essentially, or your school got a 1 for you. And then in sixth grade, your school did a lot better for you. However, that's not how we experience it, right? Mm-hmm. So, you sort of shared when I asked you how school has been for you, essentially, you shared that there are ups and downs, essentially, that there were things that were, generally speaking, good, but it varied over time. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is fairly common for most students. And there's some, and if you had that conversation with 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 students, you would begin to identify these very common experiences where we had a teacher who was really exciting and we got interested in class, right? And that's, there is sort of this universal story that every once in a while you get this teacher who's like so into what they do that you can't help be drawn along with it. Mm-hmm. There are these factors that we as adults control in the environment. And unfortunately, we haven't had, because of resources or perseverance or drive, for whatever reason, we haven't been able to make sure that every student, every day, everywhere has a marvelous experience. And I think we can't really rest as educators until we get to that point. So there'll be a lot of podcasts ahead of us and a lot of work for us. But thank you for giving me that. Yes. Sorry, Bennett, go ahead.
It's fine. I'll let it. I'm kind of curious to get your reaction about a personal anecdote of mine, because as I think about my education history, I was at a school for 12 years which specialized in helping with learning disabilities, and I definitely thrived there. There were a lot of ups and downs, and of course, being any place for over a decade, you're going to experience ups and downs. And I think that the first reflection my parents had was, you're at a school that's claiming to help you and you still need a math tutor. Like, is there something wrong? And then,
Right.
I get through, I graduate, I managed to do well in my classes. And overall, I feel a good student who was helped, who got the support that I needed that I would not have gotten just personally in the public school system. For me, it would not have been, it wouldn't have helped enough. But after graduating high school, I went away to college, and the school just was not the right fit for me. I wasn't taking super challenging classes, and that's because they have you start your first semester with half of your classes all dedicated to your major, and I was a film major. So my first semester was fairly easy. Second semester,
Right.
the work picked up because I had to start taking tougher classes, and COVID hit. We all go virtual. Next thing you know, I am mentally drained. I am exhausted. The world is exhausted. And as somebody who struggles to learn, I am even more exhausted. So I leave this school, and then and I take leave of absence, and I have what's essentially a gap year. I try to go to another school in California that I feel is not the right fit for me at all. So after literally visiting the school in the moment, I'm like, this is not right for me. And now I'm back home at community college trying to figure things out. And on top of all of this, I still struggle significantly with reading comprehension. And I went to see somebody who my mom knows, who is an expert in helping students with reading struggles. And during this visit, she also found that I was having some potential, I don't want to butcher the correct phrasing here, but it was either encoding or decoding issues with the words on the page, which led her to suggest that I go and see someone about potentially starting vision therapy, which I am now in currently. I touched on this last episode. I had my first 2 sessions last week because I have double vision, and I believe the correct phrasing is also monocular disparity. My eyes compete. They don't work together. And they're thinking that after all these years, even in being in that school, this is why I struggle to read so much. And mentally, I felt a little inferior at first, because I felt that after all those years of getting all that help, I was still struggling, and I see it as a weakness. And actually, on our episode last week, Lorraine and I had a really nice conversation where she was kind of explaining how, it might feel like a weakness to you, but really, we all have things that we could work on and improve. But just that whole anecdote, I'm curious what your thoughts might be, because, almost like picking your brain. And for me, it'd be helpful to kind of know, what's your
Yeah.
take on what I'm experiencing?
So I have this sort of take on it that has multiple levels, and as a parent who has had to make hard decisions with and for my children, as a school administrator who has been tasked with being an architect of support programs for students with disabilities, being co-president of the New York Council of Administrators of Special Education, and sort of looking at statewide how we do this work. And then just as a human being who's been in this world for 53 years, understanding what another human being's experience like has been, and empathizing with that. So there's all these sort of competing tracks going on as I'm listening. But the thing that stands out the most is this overwhelming sense of sadness that much of your educational career has been spent talking about and addressing areas identified as a deficit. And that your experience, you described the school you went to essentially as a place to help with students with learning disabilities, rather than a school for exceptionally handsome young men or whatever, right? So it's this deficit-based definition of where you were and why you were there. And that sort of seeps into the bones, right? And you are in a position where, as you consider choices in your life, this is a specter that hangs out in that conversation with you. And you say, well, I would like to do this thing. And then you think to yourself, perhaps, well, I wonder how much reading there is with that, or wonder how my reading is going to impact that work or that study. You go to school and you start to struggle, and you immediately think, it must be me, because look at all these other people around me. They seem to be okay. The reality is they all could be sitting in the class going, geez, so this makes no sense to me. But you've been in a position where you've had a deficit identified. So it's really easy for you to sort of take ownership and responsibility for your own difficulty. It just makes more sense, right? The reality is there's a lot of crappy teachers in colleges. Colleges are not necessarily great places of instruction. They're great places of thinking, and there's some great teachers there. But, I don't know if you had great teachers. My guess is probably not. You probably had maybe some okay ones. Maybe you had one or two great ones, but generally speaking, you're going to have average ones. And sometimes it's just not enough. So that is, I think, one of our epic failures as we help our students transition to post-secondary education to colleges, is that we teach them about themselves as learners, but don't teach them about learning and about the world around them as a learning environment. And we miss a few things. That's thing one. Thing two, the other thing, thinking about it as a parent who helped my kids make difficult decisions and make their choices about college, there's something that is almost epidemic in our society, and that is the expectation that all positive roads begin with a college education. And that's just simply not the truth. Sometimes a college education is the thing that gets you to a life of comfort and joy, but not always. And in fact, if you ask any adult around you, or every adult around you who's gone through that process, what brings you joy in life? What do you love doing? I would say the majority of them would pick something other than their job. So how do you create a decision process for somebody as a parent, this child that's in your care, that leads to a joyful, fulfilling life? That is something that I think is a huge challenge. And what we often replace it with is, how do you help someone pick a job? And that's a poor substitute. I'll give you a quick example from the process I went through with my youngest child, who's my son, who's 25 now. He at the junior year of high school, we started to have serious conversations about, what are you going to do next? And he wasn't sure. And we went through a process of talking with him about some fundamental questions like, what do you picture life being like after college? Oh, I want to make a lot of money. Okay, you want to make a lot of money? Let's look at the 10 highest paid careers. And then we looked at the 10 highest paid careers, and one of them was engineering. And within engineering, the highest paid engineering degrees were naval architecture and marine engineering. He also said, I don't want to work at a desk. So that means probably not naval architecture, right? That's designing ships, more like marine engineering, which is working on and building ships. So he then went to, went to the books and looked at all the programs that were in this field. And we began visiting those colleges. And the place that he picked, place that he thought he was going to go originally was New York Maritime, which is in the Bronx. And the place where he actually ended up picking and going was Texas A&M at Galveston on the Gulf Coast. And he picked it for two reasons. One, the climate, palm trees and bathing suits, not a bad place to go to college. The second thing was how happy people seemed there when he visited. And it made a big impression on him. Now, fast forward, we go through this very sort of thoughtful process. And he goes through 4 years of study, an engineering degree. So he does 150 credits, does Calc 15, whatever, does all the calcs. There's no calcs left. He's done them all. And by the time he graduated, he was fairly certain that he did not want to be a marine engineer. Now, what he gained from this process was he has a tremendous amount of knowledge in these physical sciences, but he also had the experience of working in groups and on teams to accomplish outcomes. He worked internationally during this period of time. He traveled the world. And his senior year of college, he decided he didn't want to take out any more student loans. He wanted to pay out of pocket. So he started a business. And that is what he does today. He is an entrepreneur and a business owner, works online and travels the world. Now, if when he was 17, he had said to us, I want to be an entrepreneur and travel the world, I don't think we could have seen the path to get there. And in fact, if he had said that at that point in time, I don't think he could have seen the path to get there. The practice of trying to make a decision and then going through it and then being honest with himself and determining at the end of it what he really wanted was what has gotten him to the point where he is happy with where he is, and is in a position to make wonderful money, to see more of the world than anyone else in our family ever has, and to wake up every day with a sense of purpose. And that didn't come from college. That came largely from within. So that's a long answer to your question, but I would encourage you to look at that example in that it is often very difficult to see the end of your path from the beginning. And I think if you make the choices that involve you seeking joy and working hard, you end up in the right spot at the end of it. At the beginning of your path, filmmaking seemed like where you wanted to be. There are many, many filmmakers who fulfill their training through the apprenticeship structure in the film industry. The degrees aren't required, they're helpful, but there's an apprenticeship structure still in the filmmaking industry. There are also entrepreneurial content creators that fell into a niche by beginning a podcast, by having a vlog, by putting out content that was meaningful to them. If you, Gary Vaynerchuk starts making videos about wine to sell his family's wine. And before you know it, he's an influencer who's not really who's not in the business any longer at all about selling wine. He's about, personal fulfillment, right? So if you had told him on the day that he decided to make that first video about the wine that his family was selling, that he was going to become an international entrepreneur and sort of visionary public speaker, influencer, he wouldn't have known what you were talking about, would have no idea that that's where he would end up. But the way that he got there, and if you read his book, Crushing It, I think is the name of the book, he talks about how important it is to really follow that thing that you are excited about. And if you can do that, if you can follow that thing that makes you excited, you will end up living a joyful, fulfilling life. And that, my friend, that is absolutely the antidote for many, many scary, lonely moments. Because if you're living a joyful, fulfilling life, there's not a lot of room there for depression, self-doubt, and anxiety. And ultimately, that's where we want to be.
It's where your mental health is soaring to new heights that maybe you didn't even know you had, and didn't know that you could reach. But before we kind of wrap up here, I'm looking over at Lorraine, and I'm thinking about where you are right now, Lorraine, and you're preparing for AP exams. And without putting words into your mouth, you've told your story, and it's the story of where a lot of high school kids are right now. And so as you kind of prepare for these next kind of crazy couple of days, which I know can bring a big amounts of stress, I was wondering if you had any questions for Dr. Rappleyea, or just any thoughts on anything he said, because I'm kind of thinking here, like, maybe you've got this pressure coming from school, and yet we have this amazing guest who's telling us about how we can take that stress and pressure and think about the positive outcomes.
Yeah. I first just want to address, I think, what you just said to Bennett about his trajectory and his life path. I'm gonna he's been trying to figure himself out and I've been trying to tell him, everyone's life path is different, and there's not just one way to get somewhere. And so I think what you said on here is very beneficial for Bennett, and I'm sure he's going to rave about it after we're done.
Thank you.
Good.
But yeah, it's I think about a time in my schooling career where this is probably the most stressful time that I've ever felt. One, because I think the pandemic, I know we're searching back to that, but not having, I know in New York, we have regents. And so those tests kind of prepared us for those sit down, take a test moments. And I haven't had any of those since I took an 8th grade earth science regent. The testing, being in a testing environment, a lot of us were robbed of having that practice with it. And so now we're going into APs, which have been canceled for the number of years, except for ones that were required or whatever. So it's a stressful time, not only because I want to score really well, but also the lack of real-time test preparation for it, like sitting down for 3 hours, pen and paper, let's go, let's kill this thing. So it's kind of like pulling all that, out of thin air, essentially, because in school, we practice, but it's not the same thing. So I think for my class of kids, this is it's a very new experience that shouldn't be new in junior year, but it is. So point being, it is very stressful, and I'm, telling myself, whatever number you get 1 through 5 on this, that it's going to be okay. But I always am like that student who's like, I've taken this hard class, these 4 hard classes all year, and I want it to mean something. I want it to be a college credit. I want it to transfer somewhere. I want all this work to mean something. But I think I'm trying to reframe my thinking into just taking the course and having it says a lot to colleges. And even if you don't get that 3 to 5 range, that it still shows that you took rigorous classwork and that you challenged yourself. And I guess that is, show worthy. But it is a lot to juggle right now, and it's junior year. It's the big year that all colleges are looking at. It's that big year. It's a lot, but I'm trying to dial down the stress, because I think if the stress is too high, it's not going to serve me well. So I'm trying to keep it in check. But as someone who has big goals and big aspirations, and wanting to be a doctor in the future. Like a lot of it's like, gotta pass this step to get to this step. And I'm just trying to keep the stress waves low. But it's a lot when you know what you want to do so early on in your life. And then, you want to make that dream. And there's a lot of high stake situations that, freak me out a bit. But I'm sure a lot of students are in the same boat.
Yeah. So, so as you look forward to your AP exams, right, which are typically mid-May events, you have both the experience of being sort of kind of alone in your thoughts and isolated with it. At the same time, you're going through it with a whole bunch of other peers.
Yeah.
There are a couple things that I would suggest or areas you could focus in the last few weeks leading up to your AP exams.
Well, they're actually, sorry to interrupt you, but I actually have one Wednesday. So they're like, this is go time now.
Okay. So there's some quick and dirty things, and then there's some stuff that you may have some more time to develop. The first thing is taking a test is not one thing, right? So you don't go in there, they put on, some calipers on your head and measure the amount of knowledge you have in your head. There are all these little steps that are taken to see what you know and how you can answer these questions. So the test result, that one score that you get at the end represents a whole bunch of action steps that you take and that the test designers take, and that the scoring of the test. You can have success in these little micro steps in great amounts that matter a lot more than if you focus on, I have to do well on this test. My whole future counts. My whole future is riding on this, which is kind of the place we psych ourselves up to, right? Mm-hmm. So doing things like practicing relaxation breathing days before the test will absolutely help. Being able to reduce your anxiety to a relatively, mild level is very, very important to be sort of able to be the pilot of your experience. So there's only one thing you can do, practice relaxation breathing. And there's all kinds of apps and programs and videos available to show you how to do that I would absolutely encourage you to find one that is meaningful to you and to practice several times a day leading up to it, to the point that you can just sit there, have the experience of being a little bit too anxious, and then go through that breathing exercise and change your physiology with that. That's thing one. If you have a little bit more time, I would absolutely encourage you to understand the strategy of test taking. There is a strategy to taking different tests. So AP exams, for instance, have patterns of content and questions by subject area that tend to repeat themselves. In AP US history, there are certain concepts and ideas that occur with greater frequency than others. So studying the whole book at this point is not very helpful. You've experienced all this knowledge, right? There's much of it's back there somewhere, you can recognize it, but there are absolutely things that you can focus on. And if you just simply look to your teacher or to someone else to say, hey, what are the 5 most important topics on this exam? And then to focus your time on those things. If you have a little bit more time, if there's other AP exams coming up in the future, maybe not 2 days from now, but there's other ones, we know that distributed practice is much more effective than massed practice. And what that means is cramming before the test usually doesn't help a whole lot. But studying every day for a week or for 2 weeks leading up to a test can absolutely increase your score. We also know that studying with peers versus studying alone can be very, very helpful. And I personally, it's been a long time since I've had to take a test, but and especially sort of a nationally normed test. But the last sort of national test that I took was my graduate record exams, and those are like the SATs for graduate students. And I studied with a group of 4 guys, myself included in that 4, and we studied for about 3 months. Every Saturday, we got together for a couple of hours. Each Saturday, one of us took a turn getting the donuts and coffee, and we studied together for 2.5 hours, or longer if we were really excited about it. In that group of 4, of the 4 of us, 2 of us have doctoral degrees now, and the other 2 have master's degrees. So we all went to graduate school, all did well. And in fact, my friend Julian, who's the other person who got a doctoral degree, did postdoctoral work at Harvard and is a neuroscientist. I'm now working for a state level agency that does this incredibly interesting work. And we, aren't, maybe we're smart, maybe we're not, but what we did do is take a methodical approach to studying, and that absolutely helped. And those things are all available to you. They don't take good looks, talent, or charm. You have all 3, but it doesn't require any of those. It just takes persistence and hard work, and that is the thing that you have control over. And that, I think, is the advice that I would offer to you.
Thank you so much. I think that has really helped me, and I think it's going to help so many of our listeners who this week and next week are in that same boat as I am. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I'll be practicing the breathing exercises. I've been told many times I should be doing that. We actually had a guest a couple episodes back who has his own little meditation. What would you call it, Bennett?
Well, it's he does meditation videos. He just became certified as a meditation teacher. So we were
wonderful.
So we had him
breathing
on the
exercises
podcast
right here.
We did a whole thing live on the podcast, and so I'm going to really dedicate time to do that. I've kind of put it off, but I think that will help me a lot. So
at the risk of sounding cheesy, all this talk about the tests kind of makes me think of life really is one big test, and usually Lorraine throws the metaphors out around here, but I think that on this very special season finale, I don't know if you know this, this is our season finale, and we're very proud of what we've done, and it's a culmination. This is our 2nd season together, and I think that all I can say is that between season 3 and season 4, life is going to throw a lot more challenges at all of us. Every single human being is going to be throwing challenges that they're not going to see coming, and that are going to be hard. But to kind of end on an uplifting note, I believe that we can always overcome the challenges. And on days when I feel like I can't overcome things, 5 hours past it, and I'm like, you know what? I got through it. It's fine. So Dr. Rappleyea, I mean, on this special finale episode, and as we kind of wrap up here, you're an educator, you're a father, you're a human being at the end of the day. So if there is one, any piece of advice or anything that you would have to say to somebody who may be struggling with their mental health, let's expand beyond just students here. If somebody is having a rough time, where do they begin? I mean, I know it's such a big question, but no pressure. But if you got one perfect answer here, what would you say?
Yeah, I think my answer is that it is important for all of us to cultivate hope when hope is freely available. Because at the times when it becomes difficult and hope becomes a little distant, if we've had the experience of really actively engaging in becoming a grateful person in this world and connecting with people, we end up in our times of struggle a little bit better at reaching out. But whether or not you do that, whether or not you followed all the great advice that, that flows into us from social media, from all the content creators who talk about it, from your parents, from your grandparents, whether or not you do any of those things, if you are hurting, the number one cure for that is connection. And my advice is to reach out and keep reaching out until you feel your fingers latch on to somebody. It's not easy. It is hard. It is difficult. It is scary. It is exhausting. But if you let somebody know you're struggling, it is a lot easier for them to give you help. And ultimately, if we keep it to ourselves and keep it silent and quiet, we are stuck in our loneliness. So that would be the thing that I would hope that each of us can sort of remember in those times of desperation, that if you just give people a chance to help you, 9 times out of 10, they will. Wow.
Lorraine, any closing thoughts?
No, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with that one. I like to say that, starting or joining this podcast with Bennett has been a passion project, and I feel fulfilled doing it every day, because I like to think that we are making a difference, and that we are spreading a great message, and that we're destigmatizing mental health, and I hope that as our generation continues on and further, that it's not looked at anymore as something that's wrong with you or a negative connotation, that it's a thing that is important, and that everyone has their own struggles with it at time to time, and that it's okay to ask for help, and asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It's not something negative. It's actually a positive, because if you, like you said, detect those things early, you're preventing so many things that unfortunately people lose battles over. So
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, you know what? We feel very proud here at Mental Health on the Mic that we can hopefully make a difference for you, whether you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or watching on YouTube. Thank you so much. And Dr. Rappleyea, thank you so much for closing us out on this season of Mental Health on the Mic.